Okay, it's Sunday, August the 4th, 2019. We're kind of back on schedule now. We're on lesson number 229, and this week it's the prophecies in Ruth. And we'll review our Georgetown sessions and talk a little bit about the Bible's use of drama. And we'll do the story of Ruth. Talk about the names of the characters in there and how the story of Ruth is just pretty much a dead-on parallel to the story of Christ, the church, and Israel. So that's the game plan for today, unless things change in the middle of the lesson.
She got her wish, didn't she?
What's that?
She got her wish. She married a pretty nice fellow. Ruth.
Oh, yeah. He did pretty good. So did the church. Okay, well, let's open with a word of prayer. Blessed are you, O Lord, our God, King of the universe, our creator and maker, and the one in whom we live and move and have our being. And we're grateful for the rain that you've given us and for the cooler weather. And we're just grateful that we have this opportunity together as a group, fellow believers, and to study your word and to fellowship and to enjoy this time that we have here together. So we ask your blessing on each one here, each family. We pray your angelic host to guard and help us in these days that are so full of tragedy everywhere. And we do pray for all of those who are affected by the recent disasters in this land, where people have lost their minds and have gone out and murdered with no reason. And we just pray your protection over each one of them here in this office, in this room, and in our country. And we ask this all in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay.
Did you listen to the message that Pastor Keith had this morning?
We listened to part of it.
You know, what he's talking about is people talking about the Pharisees. I thought it was the Pharisees that claim to be something they aren't, you know.
Yeah.
That guy's father is a psychiatrist. Who? The one that did the El Paso shooting? His family picture, they're all happy children.
It just seems like this is a fulfillment of Matthew 24. It says, the time of the end, that many people's love will grow cold. You would have to be very cold to do what these people have done. They have lost their minds, and I do believe that Satan is overactive right now because he knows his time is short, and there are still people in this world that can be influenced. And, the left side of the political spectrum is always criticizing the right side, who ask for prayers and thoughts in times like this, as if prayers and thoughts in their mind is just a hollow excuse for anything, because in the back of their mind, there is no God. These people that are praying to the wind. And I thought our Lieutenant Governor, what's his name?
Patrick.
No, it's not. No, Dan Patrick. He said today, he was commenting about the tragedy in El Paso, and he said, it's good to pray after the fact, but we need to be praying before this ever happens again. And the implication there is a God, and he does listen, and he will provide protection for those who ask. So it's just a sad time right now, and I suspect this is going to get worse before it gets any better.
Well, I had to hear the police bashing, and they'll still do it. Those police ran right in there immediately in both instances. There was one this morning in Dayton, Ohio. I guess y'all knew that.
Yeah.
And the police were there 1 minute, but still all these people were like calling the police pigs. So we need to pray for the police. That's
Well, absolutely, and that was one of the things that our current president has done, is he has elevated the status of the policeman. They have taken a beating, particularly in places like New York, where the police officers are being criminally assaulted for doing their job. I mean, why would you ever want to do this? And you saw the pictures this last week where the officers were out doing their job and these hooligans were throwing water on them. I mean, Who would allow that to happen unless you were devoid of any kind of,
They killed him.
what?
They're on patent.
Well,
Country killed him.
well, at any rate, we are living here in the last days. I am convinced of it. Well, I wanted to review with you our Georgetown sessions because I thought it was pretty good. I know I overwhelmed them because they had never heard any of this before. And there was a lot of people whose jaws were dropped and they were paying attention though. And so, and I'm sure they thought a lot of the things that I said were off the chart. But I'll guarantee you there's some people that are going to be looking at their Bibles a little bit differently now. That when you read the book of Revelation, there are things in there that are happening right now before your very eyes. And as I pointed out in the first session, the book of Revelation is a very detailed characterization of the elements of the day of the Lord. And we many times miss that because Revelation, John said, I was in the Spirit in the Lord's day. And in our colloquialism, the Lord's day is what? Sunday. And so everybody just passes right over that one. Well, I made a point of pointing out that the Lord's day is the day of the Lord. It's this one and the same. And the Lord's day is not Sunday. We think of it as Sunday because we've picked that up because he was resurrected on a Sunday. But the day of the Lord and the Lord's day are one and the same. And so when you get to that point, and as I pointed out to him, when was the book of Revelation written? Well, it says, I was in the Spirit on the day of the Lord. It was written in the day of the Lord. He was miraculously transported to the end of the age where he watched it all happen and he wrote it down. Where did he write it down? In the day of the Lord. So, and then the important thing about the day of the Lord is that we are not there. And there has always been an issue of a thus saith the Lord. Where is the thus saith the Lord in that? Well, it's there. We just missed it. It's 2 Thessalonians. And it's a misunderstanding and a misinterpretation of the word apostasia. And in that passage, it's very clear that it says the apostasia must happen first before the day of the Lord. And the apostasia is the departure. And the departure of what? You have to read the first part of the paragraph to figure out what the departure is, and that is our gathering together to the Lord must happen first before the day of the Lord can come. And so, I don't know about anybody else, but when I read Revelation, I need a little hope and a little security there because I don't want to go through that. And if there is reason to hope that we shall not be going through it, I want to hear it. And so that was basically my intent on session number 1, was showing them that there is hope. Yes?
The other big thing is, like, Kelly and I were fishing this tournament.
Yeah.
We're chatting about all that stuff. We said the biggest thing that people went to him afterward, is who is the Antichrist. That's totally, they have no idea. That blew them out, according to Kelly.
Yeah. Well, nobody takes the time just to look at the evidence. Hey, I'm an engineer. I read the evidence and I make a conclusion based on the evidence. I tried to lay out the evidence for them, and here's my conclusion. There's only one guy that meets all the evidence. So who else can it be? How many people do you know have a withered arm? How many people have died and come back to life? I mean, it's just not very many. And then they have to be in a particular region of the world. And they have to, and all these other things have to be, they have to fulfill. This one guy does it. So, at any rate.
Thanks for pointing that out too, because I didn't have a clue who it was.
Well, nobody does, really. And if you want to know the truth, I don't know of anybody that's teaching prophecy that's figured this one out yet. And I wouldn't have figured it out either, except, like I like to tell people, I was praying and fasting for 40 days, and the Lord sent me a vision. Well, no. Actually, I was watching the Canadian Open 3 years ago, and I felt a desire to go on the tube and find out if there was anything in the Middle East by way of a covenant that was being negotiated. And it's the funniest thing, but when I started searching, and I don't even know what I was searching for, this thing popped up on YouTube, and there was Ali Khamenei in bed, and there was some sentence in Farsi under it, and I couldn't read it. And then I found a translation, and Ali Khamenei was recovering from being blowed up. And I read more, and it said, well, he was clinically dead when he got to the hospital. And I said, wait a minute. So with that one YouTube led me to others until finally I began to look at that, and that guy filled every one of the criteria. When I went to there and looked at that, before that moment, I was convinced that the Antichrist was going to be killed in our presence. We're going to see that sometime at the end. I mean, that's kind of the way Revelation read, that he was killed and came back to life. I didn't know it was something that happened a long time before he became the leader of the country.
Did you ever think it was Osama bin Laden?
Oh, he was a candidate, all right. He was plenty evil enough, but he didn't fulfill any of the other requirements.
The Holy Spirit revealed that to you, too.
It had to be. I would like to claim that it was all my own doing. But this is, I would say that this is unusual or strange, but I've had this happen to me before. I could not, for one reason or another, I had got completely wrapped around the axle on Matthew 24. I understood what I thought was the timeline and all of the events for the pre-tribulation rapture of the church, except for Matthew 24. And I was sitting there one evening, actually laying on the floor, reading it, and I said to myself out loud, to nobody present, I said, Lord, if you want me to understand this, you're just going to have to show me. And I slammed the book and went to bed. Wow. And I said to myself, I can't figure this one out. 3 months later, I was reading, looked up Matthew 24, opened it up. I understood it like I'd known it forever. And I can't explain why I knew it, but everything suddenly fell into place. And I got to thinking, well, was I studying this and it all came? I didn't do anything. It just came there.
What is it about?
Well, the problem with Matthew 24 is, if you believe that when Jesus comes again and at the sound of the trumpet that he's gathering the church, well, guess what? We went through the tribulation, because in the sequence of events, this happens after the abomination of desolation and everything. That means the church went through the tribulation, and there's too many other passages that says that's not going to happen. And so there was a big conflict there, and that's when it dawned on me that this wasn't the last trumpet, it was the great trumpet. And who was being drawn? It was the elect. And who are the elect? That's Israel. And then I said, oh my word, Isaiah 27, you look at the last verse, and it says, at the sound of the great trump, Israel is going to be gathered together and returned to Jerusalem. This was talking about Israel. It was not talking about the church. So with that, then everything fell into line. And like I said, I didn't do anything. I didn't study it. I just threw up my hands. So.
Well, don't fall for this. Right now, I think it's in Kenya, somewhere in Africa. They're touting that Jesus has come back. There's a guy, long blonde hair, but he's not pretending to be Jesus. He has an actual ministry that reenacts things that Jesus did. Mm-hmm. But so it's going to be falsely presented as, oh, this is returning Jesus. So he's not trying to be Jesus.
He's not trying to be. Well, that's good, because I would want to make sure, if I were in his shoes, that I made sure everybody understood that I am not Jesus, because that puts you in a very bad position. Right. That makes you an antichrist. Because one of the words for antichrist is substitute deliverer. So Don't want to be that. So at any rate, the Georgetown sessions, we talked about the 7 churches and how that's Judaism. These churches are being judged by their works, not by their faith. And so that was the takeout of the 7 churches. And then, of course, the signs of Revelation 12. I was surprised anybody came back after I did that one. But that, it's scary. It's a scary thing. But I keep referring to them to the fact that this is in the day of the Lord, and you are exempt. You are not going to be there. So, and then, of course, the final one. What's that?
You have a ticket for me? Shows on my exemption.
Sorry.
Your exemption?
Sorry, Dean.
Please, okay, have faith.
You're one thing though.
But then I think the Antichrist was interesting because, well, one of the signs in Revelation 12 is the woman clothed with the sun, the moon under her feet, and 12 stars over her head. And that is a singular moment in time, September 23rd, 2017. And if in the context of things, that's in chapter 12. In my view, that's God's stamp on time saying, okay, when this time gets here, then now you can understand who the red dragon is, and you can understand who the Antichrist is. Now, the rest of the world doesn't know any of this stuff, you understand. Of course, they don't even believe in Christ, let alone an Antichrist. So, but I thought that just based on the response, the people were, let's say, more than just interested. So it was well worth the time. Okay, so today we're going to look at the Bible's use of drama, the story of Ruth, and other things. Other stuff. Okay, let's look at the Bible's use of drama. This is the story of David. And it happened in the spring of the year at the time when the kings go out to battle that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel. And they destroyed the people of Ammon and besieged Rabbah. But David remained in Jerusalem. That's the way the king is, isn't it? Hey, y'all go out there and kill them all and let me know how it worked out.
But it used to be that way.
He used to go out and he'd let them.
Oh, yeah.
So then it happened one evening that David arose from his bed and walked out on the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman bathing. Ooh. And the woman was very beautiful to behold. So David sent and inquired about the woman. And someone said, is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Elam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? And then David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her, and she was cleansed from her impurity, and he returned her to her house, and the woman conceived. And so she sent David and said, I am with child. Then David sent to Joab, saying, send me Uriah the Hittite. And Joab sent Uriah to David. Well, you can see the story here. Uh-oh, we got trouble here in River City. We better bring Uriah back home. There'll be some doubt as to where this child came from.
David killed him.
And then Uriah had come to him, and he asked Joab what he was doing and how his people were doing and how the war was prospering. And David said to Uriah, go down to your house and wash your feet. So Uriah departed from the king's house with a gift of food, and the king followed him. But Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all the servants of his lord and did not go into the house. Oh, we got trouble now in River City. He's not going in. So then they told David, saying, Uriah did not go down to his house. And David said, Uriah, you did not come on a long journey. Why did you not go down to your house? And Uriah said, the ark and Israel and Judah are dwelling in tents. And my lord Joab and his servants of my lord are encamped in the open fields. Shall I then go to my house, eat and drink, and lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I shall not do this thing. This guy had honor.
Oh, yeah.
Man, I hate it when that happens.
And he served David.
Then David said to Uriah, wait here today also and tomorrow, and I will let you depart. So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the Now, when David called him, he ate and drank before him and made him drunken at that evening and went out to lie on the bed with his servants of his Lord, but he did not go down to his house. In the morning it happened that David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. And he wrote in the letter saying, let Uriah go in the forefront in the hottest battle and retreat from him that he may be struck down and die. You know what they call this? Premeditated murder. So it was, while Joab besieged the city, he assigned Uriah a place where he knew there would be valiant men. And then the men of the city came out and fought with Joab. And some of the people of the servants of David fell, and Uriah, the Hittite, died also. Oh, I hate it when that happens. Then Joab sent and was told David all the things concerning the war, and he charged the messenger, saying, when you have finished telling of the matters of the war to the king, if it happens that the king's wrath rises, say to him, why did you approach so near to the city when you fought? Did you not know that they would be shooting from the wall? Who struck Abimelech, son of Jerushabeth? Was it not a woman who cast a piece of millstone on him from the wall so that he died at Thebez? Why did you go near the wall? Then you shall say, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. In other words, he's making up a story here, right? So the messenger went and it came to David and all that Joab had sent. And if it happens, and the messenger said to David, surely the men prevailed against us and came out to us in the field, and we drove them back as far as the entrance to the gate. And the archers shot from the wall at your servant, and some of the king's servants are dead, and your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. Then David said to the messenger, thus you shall say to Joab, do not let this thing displease you, for the sword devours one as well as another. Strengthen your attack against the city and overthrow it, so encourage him. So he's making this all up as a story. And then when the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she mourned for her husband. And when her mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. Okay. Now this is the interesting part. Then the Lord sent Nathan to David, and he came to him and said to him, there were two men in one city, one was rich, and the other was poor. The rich man had exceedingly many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing except for one little ewe lamb, which he had brought and nourished, and it grew up together with him and his children, and he ate his own food and drank from his own cup and lay with his own bosom, and he was like a daughter to him. And a traveler came to the rich man who refused to take from his own flock and from his own herd to prepare for one of the wayfaring men who had come with him. But he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him. So David's anger was greatly aroused against the man, and he said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, this man who has done this thing shall surely die. And, well, you know where this is going. And he shall restore fourfold the lamb because he did this thing and because he had no pity. Then Nathan said to David, thou art the man. Ooh! Thus says the Lord God of Israel, I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your keeping, and I gave you the house of Israel and Judah, and if that had been too little, I would have given you even more. Why have you despised the commandment of the Lord to do evil in his sight? You have killed Uriah the Hittite with the sword. You have taken his wife to be your wife, and you have killed him with the sword of the people of Ammon. So, what happened here? Well, David was confronted with a story that was designed to provoke him to wrath. And then he found out he was the story. And so, interestingly, the prophet used the analogy of the lamb. Does anyone see another analogy in all of this? Who was the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world? Did not Jesus come in to the people like a lamb?
That's right.
And wasn't he killed by the rich and the famous of his day? So there is another level to this whole story other than just David and Bathsheba. The story is a little deeper. And as the Jews say, the Bible has 3 levels of understanding. And these levels of understanding are characterized by the 3 letters. Did I say 3? I think there's 4 levels of understanding, and they're all associated with the word paradise in Hebrew, which is spelled para, P, Resh, Dalet, and Somet. So P stands for the surface text, and Resh stands for a hint of an allegory, and Dalet stands for an unfolding, where you see things even deeper, as we're seeing here in the story of David and Uriah. There is a 3rd level here, and that level is that lamb was a symbol of the Messiah who was to come, who was loved by some, but hated by the rich and the famous, and the rich and the famous killed him. And then there's another level, which is called, associated with Samak, which is the level the Jews call the Kabbalah, or the mystical. And of course, you've heard me refer to that in the very first word in the Genesis account, Bereshit. You take Bereshit and take the letters and twist them around a little bit, and it spells Aleph Batishri, which means the first day of Tishri, which is Rosh Hashanah. So the Jews believe that the world was created on Rosh Hashanah. On the 6th day, on Rosh Hashanah, Adam was created. And the second Adam, interestingly, was created, or was born, on Rosh Hashanah. So when do you think his coming again might be? Rosh Hashanah? So, yeah.
What precious on the descendants of David and Bathsheba? The son that was born and any others, what were the descendants of that?
Well, the story is that the descendant of David and Bathsheba died. Obviously, and if you'll recall the story, David prayed prostrate and naked. He prayed his heart out when he had heard the prophet say, your son's going to die. He prayed and prayed and prayed. In fact, the people who saw him praying were worried. They thought, if this kid dies, David's going to kill himself. And lo and behold, the child died. And they were all aghast because they didn't want to tell him, but they told him, and they thought, he's going to kill himself. But he didn't. He surprisingly got up, took a bath, put on his robe, and went and ate. And they asked him, he says, why didn't you, you were looking pretty bad there. Why did you suddenly have such a strange change of demeanor after this child died? And he said, well, as long as the child was alive, there was hope that the Lord would change his mind. So I did everything I could, but he didn't change his mind. So it's over. And he went on. So it was kind of unusual that David, let's face it, David was a man after God's own heart. And even though he was a premeditated murderer, he was still a man after God's own heart. And so that, in my instance, gives me hope. Because I ain't killed anybody all week. And so maybe there's hope for me.
And the kids are still alive.
Yeah, but just barely. Just barely.
What got to David was lust.
Well, talk to a few of our presidents in the recent past. What is it they say about power and authority? They all corrupt, don't they? And absolute power corrupts absolutely. So we have got a case here of the rich and the powerful. They engage in evil and hide it. They just weren't as, of course, all of us know what's going on. And with a little luck, and if QAnon is correct, we will have a little bit of justice this side of heaven. But, yeah. But QAnon made a very strange remark last week.
That was fake.
He said, everyone be safe, be careful where you go. And I thought, what's that all about? And then all of a sudden we have these tragedies, people shooting up the place. It's almost like they knew what was coming down the road. QAnon, do you know who he is? Okay, well, There is an insider in the Trump administration which has access to everything that's going on. And he, in code, puts it out on the internet. And there are those who know his code and can break it down and show you what's going on. But sometimes he just comes out and says things in the open air. And this was one of them last week. He told everyone to be careful and to look out. And we never understood what it was about. Well, now we know. Something bad was going to happen, and somehow he knew about it.
Christopher Wray came out and said that they wanted them labeled as a terrorist group. Did you hear that?
Wanted who labeled?
QAnon.
Oh, I don't know why.
That's what I was talking about. Yahoo News, which is the most bogus made-up thing you can ever find, printed that. And it said the FBI had listed QAnon as a terrorist group. That's not true. And it's a police.
Just publicity.
Well, they added that to that article. They edited it.
Well, it's Antifa that should be labeled a terrorist group, and they may yet be. So, okay, we got one more story to do here. Story Ruth. Okay, now here is the story of Ruth. Now I can either read it or I can tell you what the story is.
Tell us.
Because if I read it, it's 4 chapters. So let me just tell you the story of Ruth. Ruth begins in Bethlehem, and she is married to Elimelech, which means God is my king. And she has 2 sons, Chilion and Mahlon. Their names mean pining and sick. Now explain to me, why would you name your kid pining and sick? I mean,
Not like ugly.
yeah. So, at any rate, I say Ruth, it was actually Naomi was in, not Ruth. But Naomi was married to Elimelech, not Ruth. And so there's a famine in the land. So Naomi, Elimelech, 2 sons move off to Ammon, or Jordan today. And Chilion and Mahlon, they marry. And they marry two women of the land of Ammon. And their names are Orpah and Ruth. And then, as time goes on, Elimelech dies, Chilion dies, Mahlon dies, and a famine hits the land. I mean, you talk about a bad string of luck. And so Naomi decides she's going back to Judah because she heard that they had a good crop there, and she was hoping to be able to survive. Because you understand, she is a woman without a husband. It's going to be tough for her back then. They did not have Social Security back in those days. So she decides to go back, and she tells Ruth and Orpah, that was one of the other women that married, it was either Chilion or Mahlon. But those 2 were left with her, and she tells them both, hey, y'all go back, worship your own gods, stay with your own people. I'm leaving, I got to get out of here. And there was a tearful departing, but Orpah kissed her and went back. But Ruth said those famous words, whether thou goest, I will go. Whether thou stayest, I will stay. Where you die, I'm going to die. I ain't leaving. And yeah, your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. And so Ruth, whose name means friendship, turned out to be a real friend to Naomi and took her back, went with her back to the land of Judea, actually Bethlehem. And they, well, upon their coming, the people knew who Naomi was, and there was a big stir in the land that Naomi had come back. But Naomi, when she talked to them, she says, don't call me Naomi anymore, which means delight, but call me Mara, which means bitterness, because she was embittered by life. He said, God has done this to me, and it's all his fault. And so, in the course of events, if you are poor and you want to eat, what you do is you follow along with the reapers of the field. And according to Jewish law, the reapers of the field are not to cut the corners. They get the whole field, but they cut it like a circle, and they leave the corners. And for the corners, that's if you're poor, you go to the corners and you cut whatever's there, and you can have that. So Ruth went and found this field, and she was told about it by Naomi, that the guy who owns the field's named Boaz, whose name means in him is strength. He was a rich guy, had lots of fields, and he saw Ruth, and he asked somebody who that woman was. And the servants came to him and says, well, that's Ruth. That's the Hittite or the Amorite woman that came back with Naomi. And she's a fine person. She's been taking care of Naomi, even though, she's not even a Jew. She's taken care of her. And Boaz was quite impressed. And so he told his people that, hey, you make sure you leave a little extra for her. And he told her, okay, you stay here in my field. Don't go to anybody else's field, and I'll take care of you. You can drink the water that the field hands are doing, and you can eat with us, and we'll take care of you, because we have heard that you have taken care of Naomi. So he turns out that he was a kinsman of Elimelech. So, as the story goes, Ruth had a terrific yield. Normally you wouldn't get as much as she got, but she got a whole ephah of grain in one day, and that's about 9 gallons. And you can figure this out. 9 gallons, it takes about a quart per day to live on. So in that one day, she got enough for probably a month's worth of living and food for a month. So this was a great deal. And Naomi asked her, how things went. And then Naomi got this idea, and she tells Ruth, hey, tonight, after Boaz is finished eating, and when his stomach is full and his heart is merry, and he lays down and goes to sleep, which he usually did on the threshing floor, right by all the grain that had just gotten threshed, you go up and you lay down by his feet and uncover his feet. Now, what that means, nobody's been able to explain, but how it has something to do with the redemption process.
He just had stinky feet.
He maybe had stinky. Why would you want to lay at his feet then? But so, at any rate, Naomi told Ruth to do that, and so she did. And at midnight, Boaz wakes up, and my word, there's a woman down there. What's going on here? And so Ruth tells him that he is the Redeemer, the kinsman Redeemer, and they're wanting him to redeem the land that Naomi and Elimelech left when they left to go to Ammon. So Boaz was somewhat impressed, and he determined and swore an oath to Ruth that as sure as tomorrow's coming, I'm going to take care of this. But we got a problem. I'm not next in line for the kinsman redeemer role. There's one in front of me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to the streets of the city, at the gates of the city, and I'm going to present the story to the one who is in front of me. And if he decides to redeem the land, well, so be it. But if he doesn't, then I will, as sure as the Lord lives. And so, well, the problem with redeeming the land and everything is that all of a sudden, Naomi and Ruth are going to be in the line of succession for all this guy's property now. So the guy who was first in line, he didn't want to dilute his descendants' share of inheritance. So he says, hey, don't look at me, I ain't going to do this. If you want to redeem the land, you go redeem it. So we had one kinsman redeemer, didn't want to do the job, and I think Boaz pretty much knew that was going to be the case. And so Boaz says, okay, I will do it. And so he did, and in front of all of the people at the gate, he says, you all are witness to this. And they said, so be it. And he says, oh, by the way, I'm going to marry Ruth too. She will become my wife. And so now you have got Boaz, who redeemed the land, purchased it back from the buyer. Now, here's the rest of that story. This is a commentary by Chuck Missler. And to understand this process of redemption, you got to understand this. You can't really comprehend what's going on in Revelation chapter 5 unless you understand the events involved in the book of Ruth in the Old Testament. If you remember Revelation chapter 5, John is given the scroll that's written within and without. And no one was found that could open the scroll, which had 7 seals on it. Remember that? What was in that scroll? Well, I'll give you a clue. The Bible and the Jews believe that you are the slave of whomever you serve. When Adam followed the advice of Satan and ate the fruit of the tree, he immediately forfeited all right to planet Earth. He began to serve Satan. And when he did that, Satan got the deed to planet Earth. And now, as the Jews believe, you don't ever completely lose your inheritance, your land. It merely transfers over for a period of time to whoever purchases it. And then, as you know, there is a Jubilee year. And in the Jubilee year, all land that has been sold reverts back to its original ownership. So that's one way you can get it back. And the other way you can get it back is you can have a kinsman come and redeem the land and purchase it back for the one who sold it. So the story of Ruth involves the hero Boaz, which is the Goel, or the kinsman redeemer, whose ultimate commitment of redemption returns the land in Bethlehem to its disenfranchised owner, who was Naomi, and also takes the Gentile of Ruth. So in ancient Israel, land was never sold fee simple. It was as we do here. Since God is the real landowner, Israel was simply a tenant under conditions of obedience. When the land was sold, what the buyer received was only the use of the land, not the clear title. There were conditions under which a kinsman or the seller could redeem the land back to the original family. These conditions are typically noted on the outside of the scroll defining the transaction. So you got the story, the deed on the inside, but on the outside, here's how you redeem it. And the scroll in Revelation chapter 5 is written within and without on the backside, which identifies it as a deed subject to redemption. And a kinsman of Adam, in his role as the Goel, the kinsman redeemer, is taking possession of what he had already purchased with his blood as the sacrificial lamb. He not only purchased the lamb, but he got a bride too. Wonder who the bride was. In the book of Ruth, Naomi is in the role of Israel, exiled from her land. Boaz is her kinsman redeemer, who performs the redemption of the land, and Ruth, who is a Gentile, was purchased for a wife. See any parallels here? The macro code, which is the big picture, extends virtually to every detail of the book. It's interesting that Ruth is introduced to Boaz through an unnamed servant, functioning as the Holy Spirit. The church, as the Gentile bride of Christ, is introduced to the ultimate kinsman redeemer by the Holy Spirit also. And it's interesting that Ruth learns how to deal with this situation from Naomi. How did the church learn anything about Jesus, the Redeemer? They learned about it from The Jews. The Jews who were God's oracle people, and the Torah. So we learn of God's plan of redemption through his dealings with Israel, and it's also provocative that in the story, Naomi learns of Boaz through Ruth. Now, Boaz, the kinsman redeemer, is in the role of the Messiah. So the church, the Jews missed the kinsman redeemer. And it was only through the church that we brought up the issue and said, look, you guys missed the boat. Here is Messiah right here. And who, to this day, is the fastest growing group in Christianity? It's the Jewish people, the so-called Messianics of Judaism. And why are they growing so fast? Well, one reason is because they can relate everything Christ did to their own holy days. They see him as the Passover lamb, and once that light goes off, man, they are, come in,
Come on in, the Holy Spirit.
come on in, the water's fine. So, at any rate, Naomi learns of Boaz through Ruth, and as Chuck says, the implication of that subtlety is left to the diligent. That means if you're smart enough, you can figure that one out. I think we already figured it out.
But Amalek was a relative of Boaz, and so
That's correct.
Naomi didn't know him, or
Didn't know who.
Boaz.
No, she knew him. Once
But
Ruth
that says he learns of Boaz through Ruth.
No, well, she learned that where Boaz was,
Oh, I see.
Okay.
that he had the field, and that's where she was. She told Naomi that this is where she'd been gleaning, and that's when Naomi made the observation that, oh, he is a kinsman. So, the story goes back and forth here. So, there is multiple levels of understanding in Ruth. And as Chuck puts it, it's interesting that this pivotal book is also associated with the Feast of Shavuot, the Feast of Pentecost. And he says, is that a coincidence? Well, Chuck believes that the rapture of the church is going to happen on Pentecost. He missed part of the story, and that is, part of the story was, it was during the barley harvest, but it was also later the wheat harvest. And interestingly, the barley, when you winnow barley, the seed and the husk are so loosely connected together, all you have to do is take it and throw it up in the air, and it separates. And the wind blows the husk away. Well, how do you winnow wheat? Well, you can throw that wheat, the husk up in the air all day long, and it's never going to separate. But guess what you have to do to get the wheat to separate? You have to run a sledge over it called a tribulum. Anybody see anything there? And the wheat harvest is right around Rosh Hashanah. And there's a tribulum or a tribulation in order to separate the wheat from the chaff. So my point would be, well, Chuck, I agree most with everything, but I do not agree that the church is separated from the land on Pentecost. The meaning of Pentecost is one of the only holy days that we know in the scripture has been fulfilled. And you know how we know that?
That's a good answer.
I'll read you the story here. Because this is another case where when you're reading the Greek, if you don't get the story right,
Change the
you'll
message.
miss something. And put these tabs on my pages, and the tabs are all toward the pages, and I had to stick them back down. This is Acts chapter 2. And when the day of Pentecost had come, actually some versions say fully come, they were all together and in one place. You know what it really says? And when the day of Pentecost had been fulfilled, they were all together in one place.
Oh, wow.
The fulfillment of Pentecost was when the Holy Spirit came down, dwelt among men, and betrothed the church. And the church was either born or conceived, however you want to look at it.
Well, and what's strange about that is 3,000 people.
Yes, when the law was given on Mount Sinai, 3,000 people were killed. The letter killeth, but the Spirit giveth life. What happened on Pentecost? 3,000 were saved because the Spirit gave life. So, the
How were
point.
they killed?
What's that?
How were they killed? They just dropped dead, or?
Who on Mount Sinai? The earth opened up and swallowed them. If you will recall, this was the time of the first visit of Nibiru to the interior of the solar system in modern civilized times. The earth was under tremendous stress. One of the historians wrote that 3 days Nibiru was close to the earth, and the earth shook. There were lightning strikes, big lightning strikes. The sky was full of meteors. They killed an awful lot of people. And the guy said, if this thing would have lasted one more day, no life on planet Earth would have survived. And what did Jesus say? Unless those days be shortened, no life would have survived. So that's the story about that. So the book of Ruth, if you want to count Ruth as a prophetic book, which I think you can, then actually the Bible is closer to 30% prophecy rather than 27% prophecy, as some have said. So the book of Ruth shows us in a drama the relationship between Israel and the church, the bride of Christ. And it did it in a drama that most would miss unless you had the story at the end already. And you knew that the bride of Christ was a Gentile, just like Ruth. So any questions? Yeah.
Boaz must have bought the land back he already owned from the landowner, isn't it?
Yeah, he bought it back from whoever purchased it. And so, like you said, what's that?
Was he the original owner?
Not Boaz, Elimelech was.
Okay.
And Elimelech, it would have been passed down to his two sons, Chilion and whoever the other guy was, I forget, Mahon. So, but when they both died, now Naomi is left out in the cold because she can't redeem the land because she doesn't have the money. And of course, if she lived long enough to the next Jubilee year, then she would have got it back. But she's old, so she's likely not going to make it. So, but the story here is the book of Ruth. If you look at it in careful detail, and look at it not in the surface text, but in about 3 levels down, you get the story of the relationship between Israel, the church, and the bride, how the bride comes into this picture, and most importantly, the kinsman redeemer, because we have a kinsman redeemer. He came here and lived in mortal body just as we did, and was able to provide the price. And what was the price? The blood of the Lamb was the price, and he was the Lamb. So this is the story of the book of Ruth. Next time you read it, you can understand some of the subtleties that are in there.